everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something that seems pretty basic on the surface, but trust me, it's way more complex than you think. We're talking about prepositions, we've got a ton of linguistic research here, and we're ready to unpack all the little nuances of these words that are absolutely essential to English.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Right. You know how sometimes you hear a sentence and something feels a bit off, but you can't quite put your finger on why? Well, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that the culprit is a misplaced or misused preposition.
For sure.
So let's start by diving into how these prepositions work. And I think the best place to start is with some of the most common ones, like in, on, and at.
Yeah, those are the big three.
They really are.
What's so interesting about these is that they can be used for both time and space.
Right.
But their meanings shift so subtly depending on the context.
Yeah.
For example, if you say, in the garden, you're saying a location within the boundaries of the garden. But if you say in July, you're talking about a period of time.
It's amazing how these tiny words can convey so much information.
It really is.
And I think that's honestly what makes them so challenging for English language learners.
Absolutely. Even small changes can make a big impact on the meaning of the sentence. Like, think about the difference between saying, I'm at the park and I'm in the park. At suggests you're just near the park, while in implies you're inside its boundaries.
That reminds me of this funny story I read in one of these articles about this tourist who asked for directions to a restaurant, and they were told it was on the main street. Well, this tourist ended up on the roof of a building because they took on literally.
Wow.
I know.
The perfect example of how you got to understand those little nuances, because they're not just about literal placement. They're about conveying a meaning or an intention.
Right. Let's dig a bit deeper into those nuances, especially with in, on, and at.
Okay.
What are some other examples of how they change meaning depending on whether we're talking about time or location?
Okay, well, let's consider the preposition on. If you say on the table, it's clear you mean something's on the surface of the table. But if you say on Monday, you're referring to a specific day.
So on can pinpoint a location, but also a specific point in time.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It's like it's anchoring the action or object to that particular moment.
Exactly. And the same goes for at. If you say at the corner, you're referring to a specific point. But if you say at 3 p.m., you're pinpointing a precise time.
Okay, this is starting to make more sense. But what about in? We already talked about in the garden for location, but how does that work for time?
So in is used for broader periods, like months, years, decades, even centuries. For example, you'd say in January, in 2024. In the 1980s or in the 21st century.
So in is like the wide-angle lens of time. It's giving us that broader perspective, while on and at are zooming in on those specific days and times.
That's a great analogy. And it's these subtle distinctions that can trip up even experienced English speakers sometimes.
I know. I've definitely made my fair share of prepositional mistakes over the years.
Oh, yeah?
But that's how we learn, right? By paying attention and practicing.
Absolutely. The more you pay attention to how they're used, the more you'll appreciate the richness and complexity they bring to the language.
So we've covered in, on, and at. What other common prepositions should we explore?
Well, let's move beyond those three and explore some prepositions that are all about spatial relationships. Think about under, over, between, and among.
Ooh, those are good ones. I'm especially curious about between and among because I know those two often cause confusion.
Rightfully so. They both involve positioning things in relation to others, but in slightly different ways.
Okay, so let's break them down.
Right.
Let's unpack those two and see what makes them tick.
So between is used when you're talking about the relationship between two specific people or things. For example, the letter is between page 10 and 11, or the shop is between the bank and the post office.
Okay, so it's about something being situated with two distinct points on either side.
Exactly. Now, among is used when something is situated within a larger group or collection of things.
Yeah.
So instead of two specific endpoints, it's more about being surrounded.
Okay.
You might say, there's a red apple among the green ones. Or, I felt comfortable among my friends.
So between is for two, and among is for more than two.
That's the general rule of thumb, yes.
Yeah.
Though, of course, there are always exceptions and nuances in how these prepositions are used. But that's what makes language so fascinating, right?
It definitely keeps things interesting. Speaking of interesting, let's talk about those prepositions that add a sense of movement and direction to our sentences.
You're thinking about to and toward, into and onto. These add a dynamic element, telling us not just where something is, but how it got there.
So instead of just describing a static scene, we're adding a sense of action. It's like watching a movie unfold in our minds.
Precisely. Think about the difference between saying, the book is on the shelf.
Yeah.
And she placed the book onto the shelf. That onto gives us a sense of movement and intention.
And what about toward? How does that preposition add a sense of direction?
Toward implies movement in a particular direction, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the destination is reached. For example, you might say, he walked toward the park without knowing if he actually arrived.
I see. So it's about the direction of movement, not necessarily the end result.
Exactly.
That's a subtle but important distinction. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From basic concepts like in, on, and at, to more dynamic prepositions that indicate movement. But before we move on to even trickier prepositional territory,
Okay.
what are some key takeaways our listeners should remember?
Well, I think the main takeaway is the prepositions are much more than just these little words. They play a crucial role in conveying meaning, adding detail, and creating vivid images in our minds.
And even though they can be tricky, they're also fascinating to explore and essential for mastering English. So stay tuned, because we're just getting started. We'll be back with even more prepositional insights in part 2 of this deep dive.
Welcome back. In part 1, we explored some common prepositions and how they function in both time and space. But, as we know, the English language loves to keep things interesting.
It does.
So let's turn our attention to those prepositions that often cause confusion, even for native speakers.
It's true. There are some tricky prepositional pairs out there that can make even the most seasoned English speaker pause and think twice.
Right.
But don't worry, we're here to demystify those confusing duos.
Excellent. I'm ready to tackle those tricky pairs. Which ones should we start with?
Let's start with beside and by. These two are often used interchangeably, but there's a subtle distinction in their meanings.
Beside means right next to, with no space between. Imagine two friends sitting beside each other on a bench.
Okay, so beside is all about close proximity.
Yes.
What about by?
By is a bit more flexible. It simply means near, but not necessarily touching. So you might say, I'm by the window, even if you're a few steps away.
So beside is like your best friend, always right by your side, while by is more like that acquaintance you see around sometime.
Exactly.
But not super close to.
Yeah. Let's move on to another pair. They can cause confusion.
Okay.
Above and over.
Ooh, yes. I've definitely mixed those up before. What's the key difference?
Above simply means at a higher level, but not touching. Imagine a bird soaring above the trees. There's clear space between them.
Okay.
Over, on the other hand, can mean directly above, potentially touching, or even covering. Think of a blanket draped over a sleeping child.
So above is more about vertical distance.
Yes.
While over can imply covering or encompassing.
Precisely. And this distinction can be important in certain contexts. For example, if you're giving directions, you might say, go over the bridge.
Yeah.
To indicate crossing it.
Right.
But you wouldn't say, go above the bridge.
That makes perfect sense. It's all about choosing the right preposition to convey that specific meaning you intend.
Right.
Are there any other prepositional pairs we should watch out for?
Let's talk about before and after.
Okay.
These prepositions are quite versatile, working for both time and order. For instance, I'll meet you before lunch refers to time, while line up one after another refers to order or sequence.
So they can add clarity to timelines and actions.
Yeah.
Very useful. Speaking of useful, let's move on to a topic I find particularly fascinating, but also a bit daunting. Phrasal verbs.
Phrasal verbs are a unique and essential part of English. They can be a bit tricky to master, but they add a level of richness and expressiveness to our communication.
Absolutely. They're like these little linguistic puzzles where the meaning of the verb changes completely depending on the preposition that follows.
Exactly. For example, look up means to search for information, but look after means to take care of someone.
Right.
The preposition completely transforms the meaning of the verb.
And the thing is, there are so many of them.
I know.
It's like there's a whole secret language within English that relies on these combinations of verbs and prepositions.
That's a great way to think about it. And the best way to learn them is through exposure and practice. The more you read, listen, and use them, the more natural they'll become.
Speaking of practice, let's delve into some specific examples and see how they work in different contexts.
Okay.
What are some common phrasal verbs that our listener might encounter in everyday conversation?
Well, there are countless examples, but let's start with some common ones. How about give up?
Okay, give up. That means to quit or stop trying, right?
Exactly. And it's a great example of how the preposition changes the meaning. Give, on its own, means to offer something to someone.
Right.
But when you add up, it becomes the opposite. It means to stop offering effort.
That's so interesting. It's like the preposition as a layer of complexity and nuance.
Precisely. Now let's look at another example.
Okay.
Give in.
Give in. That means to surrender or yield to
Yeah.
something, right?
Yes. And again, you can see how the preposition changes the meaning. Give on its own implies a transfer of something.
Right.
But give in means to cease resistance.
This is fascinating. It's like prepositions are these tiny but powerful tools that can completely alter the meaning of a verb.
Absolutely. And that's what makes phrasal verbs both challenging and rewarding to learn. They force you to think about the nuances of language and to pay attention to how different words interact with each other.
Let's explore a few more examples.
Okay.
How about take off?
Take off is a great one because it has multiple meanings depending on the context.
Uh-huh.
It can mean to remove something, like clothing,
Oh,
or to depart, like an airplane.
that's true. I remember being confused by take off. When I first started learning English, it seemed like it could mean so many different things.
It's definitely one of those that can be tricky to master. But once you understand the different contexts in which it's used, it becomes much clearer.
Okay, one more example. What about look out?
Look out is a phrasal verb that means to be careful or aware of potential danger. You might say, look out for cars when you cross the street.
Ah, so it's a warning
Oh,
or
cool.
cautionary phrase.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how phrasal verbs can be used to express
Yeah.
a wide range of emotions and intentions.
I'm starting to see why phrasal verbs are such an important part of the English language. They add a level of depth and expressiveness that you just can't get with single word verbs.
Absolutely. And while they may seem daunting at first, they're actually quite logical and intuitive once you start to understand the patterns and meanings behind them.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground in this episode. From those tricky prepositional pairs to the fascinating world of phrasal verbs. But there's still more to explore. We'll be back in part 3.
To wrap up this deep dive and leave you with some final thoughts on the power and nuance of prepositions. Welcome back to the final part of our prepositional deep dive. We've explored so much already, from the basics of in, on, and at, to those tricky pairs like beside and by, and even the fascinating world of phrasal verbs. Now, before we wrap things up, let's pull back the lens a bit and consider the broader impact of these seemingly small words.
You know, it's fascinating how these little words can completely change the image that we create in our minds, for instance. Think about the cat sat under the table versus the cat perched on the table. The prepositions instantly shift our mental picture, even though the subject and verb is the same.
That's so true. It's like they're adding those subtle details that give our language depth and texture.
And they can even influence the tone and register of our communication.
Consider the difference between saying in regard to versus just about. The former sounds much more formal, doesn't it?
It does. It's like switching from jeans and a t-shirt to a suit and tie. Just by changing a preposition makes you realize how much power these little words hold.
Absolutely. They may seem insignificant on the surface, but they play a crucial role in shaping how we express ourselves
Yeah.
and how our message is received.
Now, I know we touched on phrasal verbs in the last segment, but I feel like there's still so much to unpack there. What are some of the common mistakes English language learners make when it comes to phrasal verbs?
One common mistake is using the wrong preposition, for example. Saying look for instead of look after, when you need to say take care of. These errors can lead to confusion or even change the meaning of the sentence entirely.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easy to see how even a small prepositional slip-up can lead to a big communication breakdown.
Another challenge is understanding the difference between separable and inseparable phrasal verbs. Some phrasal verbs, like turn on or pick up, can be separated by the object, while others, like look after or run into, cannot.
So the placement of the object matters, depending on the type of phrasal verb.
Exactly.
That adds another layer of complexity to the mix.
It does. But the good news is,
Mm-hmm.
with practice and exposure, these patterns become more familiar
Mm-hmm.
and easier to navigate.
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from this deep dive is that mastering prepositions is an ongoing journey.
Absolutely.
There's always something new to learn and discover about these seemingly simple words.
I completely agree. And it's a journey worth taking, because prepositions are the key to unlocking the nuances and richness of English. They allow us to paint vivid pictures with words, express ourselves with precision, and even add a touch of humor or formality to our communication.
What's so fascinating is that even though we use prepositions every day, we rarely stop to think about the impact they have on our language.
That's true.
But after this deep dive, I don't think I'll ever look at a preposition the same way again.
I think that's the beauty of language exploration. The more we delve into the intricacies of grammar and vocabulary, the more we appreciate the complexity and beauty of this system that we use to communicate every day.
So as we wrap up this prepositional adventure, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
Okay, think about this. Have you ever had a misunderstanding or a moment of confusion because of a preposition? Perhaps someone said they'd meet you in the library, but you were waiting at the library. Or maybe you misinterpreted a phrasal verb and ended up doing something completely different from what was intended. These small words can have a big impact. So it's worth taking the time to truly understand their nuances.
That's a great point to ponder. It reminds us that even though prepositions may seem like minor players in the grammar world, they can have a major impact on how we communicate and understand each other. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and never underestimate the power of a well-placed preposition. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.